The headlines tell you Trump is sending troops to the Mexican border. What they don't tell you is why this moment represents something far more dangerous than a simple immigration crackdown. We're watching the militarization of economic desperation, and it's a pattern we've seen before, right before empires make their most catastrophic mistakes. Here's what's really happening when a declining superpower can no longer compete economically, when its infrastructure crumbles while its debt explodes, when its working class grows angrier and its elite grows wealthier. That's when military force becomes the language of first resort, not last. The troop deployment isn't about border security. It's about projecting strength while concealing weakness. It's about distracting a population from the economic failures at home by creating a crisis at the doorstep. History shows us that empires don't collapse from external enemies. They collapse from internal contradictions they refuse to address. And right now, we're refusing to address ours. The real question isn't what Trump is doing at the border. The real question is what he's trying to hide about what's happening inside our own economy, our own communities, our own unraveling social contract. Let me break this down. Let me start by telling you something that might sound counterintuitive, but it's absolutely crucial to understanding what's unfolding right now. When you see military troops being deployed to a border, your first instinct is to think about security, about threats, about protection. But I want you to think about something else entirely. I want you to think about economics. I want you to think about what happens when an economic system that has dominated the world for 75 years begins to lose its grip, begins to see its influence wane, begins to watch as other powers rise and challenge its supremacy. Because that's what this is really about. This troop deployment to Mexico isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening at a moment when the United States is facing the most profound economic challenges it has faced since the Great Depression, and I don't say that lightly. Think about what's been happening in the American economy over the past several decades. We've watched as manufacturing jobs disappeared, shipped overseas to countries where labor was cheaper and regulations were weaker. We've watched as wages stagnated for the vast majority of working Americans while productivity continued to climb. We've watched as wealth concentrated at the very top, creating levels of inequality that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age. We've watched as our infrastructure crumbled, as our schools struggled, as our healthcare system became increasingly unaffordable, as our housing market priced out entire generations. And through all of this, through all of these fundamental economic failures, our political class has offered us what? They've offered us culture wars, they've offered us distractions, they've offered us scapegoats, and now they're offering us militarization. When Trump talks about sending troops to the Mexican border, he's tapping into something very real. There is genuine anxiety in this country. There is genuine fear about the future. People are worried about their jobs, about their livelihoods, about whether their children will have the opportunities they had. But here's the thing that's so insidious about this moment. Instead of addressing the actual causes of that anxiety, instead of confronting the economic system that has failed so many people, the response is to militarize a border and blame immigrants for problems that have nothing to do with immigration. It's classic misdirection, and it's a strategy that's as old as empires themselves. Let me take you back in history for a moment because I think it's essential to understand the pattern we're seeing. The Roman Empire, at its height, was the most powerful force the world had ever known. It had military superiority, economic dominance, cultural influence that spread across continents. But as that empire began to decline, as its economic base weakened, as internal contradictions became more pronounced, what did it do? It militarized its borders. It sent legions to the frontiers. It built walls. It blamed barbarians for problems that were fundamentally internal. The Roman economy was built on slavery and conquest. And when those sources of wealth began to dry up, when the empire could no longer expand, it turned inward and became increasingly authoritarian. It didn't solve its economic problems. It couldn't. The system itself was the problem. And eventually, despite all those troops, despite all those walls, the empire collapsed. Now, I'm not saying that America is Rome. The specifics are different, the context is different, but the pattern is remarkably similar. What we're seeing right now is an empire in decline trying to use military force to paper over economic failure. And that should terrify us because it never works. It didn't work for Rome. It didn't work for the British Empire when it tried to hold on to its colonies, even as its economic base eroded. It didn't work for the Soviet Union when it tried to maintain its sphere of influence, even as its economy stagnated, and it won't work for the United States. Let's talk specifically about what's happening with Mexico, because this relationship is so much more complex than the simplistic narratives we're being fed. Mexico is not some random country on our southern border. It is our third largest trading partner. American companies have billions of dollars invested in Mexican factories, in Mexican supply chains, in Mexican infrastructure. The North American economy is deeply integrated. When you buy a car that says made in America, chances are significant portions of that car were manufactured in Mexico. When you buy electronics, when you buy appliances, when you buy countless consumer goods, those supply chains run through Mexico. This isn't some hostile foreign nation. This is an economic partner that our own corporations have spent decades integrating into their production processes. So when Trump talks about sending troops to Mexico, when he talks about militarizing that border, what is he actually threatening? He's threatening the very economic relationships that American corporations depend on. He's threatening supply chains that have been carefully constructed over decades. He's threatening economic integration that has been profitable for American businesses. And for what? To score political points, to create the appearance of strength, to distract from the fact that his economic policies, like those of his predecessors, have failed to address the fundamental problems facing working Americans. But here's where it gets even more interesting, and this is where I really want you to pay attention. The troop deployment isn't just about Mexico, it's about China, it's about Russia, it's about a changing global order that terrifies the American establishment because they're losing control. For decades after World War II, the United States was the unquestioned hegemon. We had the strongest military, the largest economy, the dominant currency. We could dictate terms to the rest of the world. We could impose our economic model, our political system, our cultural values on countries across the globe. And if they resisted, we had the military power to enforce compliance. But that world is ending. China's economy is now comparable to ours by many measures and is growing faster. Russia has reasserted itself as a major power. Countries across the global south are refusing to accept American dictates the way they once did. The dollar's dominance as the global reserve currency is being challenged, and the American establishment is panicking. When you panic, when you feel your power slipping away, you do irrational things. You lash out. You try to demonstrate strength, even when doing so is counterproductive. And that's exactly what we're seeing with this troop deployment. It's not strategic. It's not well thought out. It's a reaction, an emotional response to a loss of control. And the problem with emotional responses in geopolitics is that they tend to make situations worse, not better. They tend to create conflicts where none needed to exist. They tend to push potential partners into the arms of rivals. And that's precisely what's happening right now. Mexico has options that it didn't have 20 years ago. If the United States becomes too unreliable, too aggressive, too difficult to deal with, Mexico can turn to China, it can turn to other trading partners, it can diversify away from dependence on the American market. And this isn't just theoretical. We're already seeing it happen. China is increasing its investments in Latin America. Chinese companies are building infrastructure, establishing trade relationships, offering alternatives to American economic dominance. Every time the United States acts aggressively toward its neighbors, every time it militarizes relationships that should be economic and diplomatic, it pushes those countries toward China. We're creating our own competition. We're driving away partners. And we're doing it because we can't face the reality that our economic model is failing. Let's talk about that economic model for a moment, because this is really the heart of the issue. The American economy for the past 40 years has been built on a specific set of principles. We call it neoliberalism, though that term doesn't really capture how it's impacted ordinary people's lives. The idea was simple: deregulate industries, cut taxes, especially for corporations and the wealthy, weaken unions, privatize public services, and let the market solve everything. We were told that this would create prosperity for everyone, that wealth would trickle down, that a rising tide would lift all boats. And what happened? Wealth concentrated at the top, the middle class hollowed out, working people saw their living standards stagnate or decline, public services deteriorated, infrastructure crumbled, and through it all, we were told to be patient, to trust the system, to believe that eventually the benefits would reach everyone. Well, it's been 40 years. The benefits never came, and now people are angry. They have every right to be angry. The system promised them prosperity and delivered precarity. It promised them security and delivered anxiety. It promised them opportunity and delivered debt and dead-end jobs. So they're looking for answers. They're looking for explanations. They're looking for someone to blame. And rather than pointing to the actual problem, rather than examining the economic system itself, our political leaders are pointing to immigrants, to foreign countries, to external threats. It's so much easier to blame someone else than to confront the uncomfortable truth that the problem is internal, that it's structural, that it requires fundamental change to address. This is where the troop deployment becomes really dangerous. It's not just a distraction, it's a commitment to continuing down a failed path. Every dollar spent on military deployments is a dollar not spent on infrastructure, on education, on healthcare, on the kinds of investments that might actually improve people's lives. Every hour of political debate focused on border militarization is an hour not spent discussing how to create good jobs, how to make housing affordable, how to ensure retirement security. The militarization isn't just ineffective at solving our problems, it actively prevents us from addressing them by consuming resources and attention that could be directed toward actual solutions. And there's another dimension to this that we need to talk about, something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in mainstream discussions: the militarization of the border, the deployment of troops, the rhetoric of invasion and threat. All of this is preparation for something darker. When economic systems fail, when inequality becomes extreme, when people lose faith in democratic institutions, there's always a temptation for those in power to turn to authoritarianism. You create an external enemy. You declare a state of emergency. You grant extraordinary powers to the executive. You normalize military presence in civilian spaces. You criminalize dissent by equating it with supporting the enemy. This is the playbook, and we've seen it play out in country after country throughout history. I'm not saying we're there yet. I'm not saying we've crossed some irreversible line, but I am saying that we're moving in that direction, and the troop deployment to Mexico is a step along that path. It normalizes military solutions to political problems. It establishes precedents for executive action without congressional approval. It creates infrastructure and institutional arrangements that can be turned inward. And most dangerously, it cultivates a mindset among the public that threats are everywhere, that we're under siege, that we need strong leaders to protect us, even if that means sacrificing democratic norms and civil liberties. Think about the logic that's being deployed here. We're told that there's a crisis at the border, that waves of immigrants are overwhelming our systems, that drug cartels are flooding our country with fentanyl, that our sovereignty is under threat, and therefore we need troops, we need walls, we need strict enforcement, we need to treat our southern border like a war zone. But let's examine these claims critically. Is immigration at unprecedented levels? No. We've had higher levels of immigration at various points in American history. Are immigrants causing economic problems? No. Study after study shows that immigration is economically beneficial, that immigrants contribute more in taxes than they consume in services, that they start businesses at higher rates than native-born Americans, that they fill essential roles in our economy that would otherwise go unfilled. Is drug trafficking primarily an immigration issue? No. The fentanyl crisis is driven by demand in the United States, by the failure of our healthcare system to address pain management and addiction, by economic despair that drives people to seek escape. Stopping immigration doesn't stop drug trafficking. The cartels will find other ways, just as they always have. So, if the stated reasons for the troop deployment don't hold up under scrutiny, what's the real purpose? The real purpose is political theatre. It's about appearing strong to a domestic audience. It's about appealing to voters who have been taught to fear immigrants, who have been told that their economic struggles are caused by people crossing the border rather than by the billionaires who have captured our political system. It's about creating a spectacle that distracts from substantive policy failures. And tragically, it works. People see troops deploying and they feel like something is being done. They feel like their concerns are being taken seriously. They don't stop to ask whether this action will actually address the underlying problems, whether it will make their lives better, whether it's the most effective use of resources. They just see action and feel reassured. But we should ask those questions. We should demand answers, because this isn't just wasteful, it's actively harmful. It harms our relationship with Mexico, a relationship we depend on economically. It harms our standing in the world, making us look like a country that can't distinguish between military threats and immigration policy. It harms immigrants who are fleeing violence and poverty, treating them as enemies rather than as human beings seeking better lives. And ultimately, it harms American democracy by normalizing militarization and executive overreach. Let me connect this to the broader economic picture, because this is where everything comes together. The United States is facing a debt crisis. Our national debt is now over $34 trillion and growing. We spend more on our military than the next 10 countries combined. We spend more on healthcare than any other developed nation, yet have worse outcomes and tens of millions without adequate coverage. Our infrastructure is rated D+ by civil engineers. Our public schools are underfunded. Our social safety net is threadbare. We have homelessness in the richest country in human history. We have children going hungry. We have people dying because they can't afford insulin. These are the real crises. These are the problems that actually affect Americans' daily lives. And what are we doing about them? We're sending troops to the Mexican border. The resources being consumed by this deployment could transform communities. They could rebuild schools. They could repair bridges and roads. They could fund job training programs. They could subsidize childcare. They could expand healthcare access. But instead, they're being used for a political stunt that will do nothing to improve anyone's life. And this is the pattern we need to break. This is the cycle of misdirection and militarization that is driving us toward catastrophe. I want you to understand that what's happening right now is a choice. It's not inevitable. It's not the only option. There are alternative paths we could take. We could invest in economic development in Central America so people don't feel compelled to migrate. We could reform our immigration system so it's efficient and humane. We could address the economic inequality in our own country so working Americans aren't struggling and looking for scapegoats. We could build diplomatic relationships based on mutual respect and shared prosperity rather than domination and military threat. These options exist. They're realistic. They would be more effective than what we're doing now, but they require us to think differently about how we relate to the world and how we structure our economy. The tragedy is that the people pushing for militarization know that it won't solve our problems. They're not naive. They understand that troops at the border won't bring back manufacturing jobs. They understand that walls won't make healthcare affordable. They understand that military force won't rebuild our infrastructure. But solving those problems would require confronting powerful interests. It would require taking on corporations that profit from the current system. It would require raising taxes on the wealthy. It would require empowering workers and strengthening unions. It would require a fundamental restructuring of economic priorities, and they don't want to do that. So instead, they give us theater, they give us spectacle, they give us troops at the border and tell us we're being protected. We're at a pivotal moment in American history. The decisions we make now will determine what kind of country we become, what kind of world we inhabit. We can continue down the path of militarization, of blaming others for our internal failures, of trying to maintain dominance through force, even as our economic foundation crumbles. That path leads to conflict, to isolation, to decline, or we can choose a different path. We can face our economic problems honestly. We can build a system that works for everyone, not just the wealthy few. We can engage with the world as partners rather than as overlords. We can invest in our people and our future rather than in walls and weapons. The choice is ours, but we need to make it consciously, understanding what's really at stake in moments like this troop deployment to Mexico. This isn't about border security. It's about what kind of country we want to be and whether we have the courage to build it.